Welcome again, everyone. Well, could Russia be getting a taste of its own medicine? Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky seems to think so. And it's all happening as Ukraine forces gain grounds in Kursk. They are said to currently control 1,000 square kilometers of the town. President Zelensky has vowed that as Russia's President Vladimir Putin brought war to others, war is now coming to his country. He made the promise in his usual nightly address from Kyiv. Mr. Zelensky says the cross-border incursion into Kursk can help bring peace closer by putting pressure on Moscow. In his words, Russia must be forced to make peace if Mr. Putin wants to fight so badly. Meanwhile, Ukraine's security service has issued a statement saying that Russia is trying to blamelessly accuse Ukraine's military of war crimes amidst incursion. The statement adds that Russia may stage war crimes and accuse Kyiv of carrying them out. President Vladimir Putin has described the offensive as a major provocation, vowing Ukraine will receive what he called a worthy response. The United States has said Mr. Putin's threats are nothing new. More on the incursion by Ukraine into Russia. Kyiv's top commander, Alexander Zelensky, has confirmed that just how much of Kursk is now under Ukrainian control, 1,000 square kilometers. He made the comments during an emergency meeting with top officials in Kyiv, saying that Ukraine will continue its offensive operation in the region. Earlier, Kursk's acting governor, Alexei Smirnov, described the situation in the Russian border territory as difficult, stating that 28 settlements are under Ukrainian control. Meanwhile, the Ukrainian Air Force says its air defenses destroyed 30 of 38 Russia-launched drones overnight. Air raid alerts were activated in parts of Ukraine with a threat of fresh air attacks from Russia. Officials have also restricted movements for Ukrainian civilians within a 20-kilometer zone bordering Russia. In addition to Kursk, Ukraine is continuing with its incursion of the Russian city of Belgorod. The Russian Emergency Ministry says around 200 displaced Kursk residents have arrived in Moscow with provision of about 400 temporary accommodation centers to house around 30,000 displaced residents. So far, 121,000 people have fled the Kursk region and about 59,000 others are still waiting to be evacuated. The surprise incursion is viewed as the biggest offensive the war has seen since it began in 2022. In the meantime, former U.S. President Donald Trump is accusing his successor, Joe Biden, of bringing the world to the brink of a nuclear war by making threats against Russia and causing the Ukraine conflict. He made the accusation during his conversation with ex-CEO Elon Musk on the platform on Monday. In his words, "I could have stopped the war. A smart president could have stopped that. I thought Russian President Vladimir Putin was a good negotiator. I thought he was doing that to negotiate." But the Biden administration started using threats. For instance, he said that Ukraine can be a NATO country. For decades, Ukraine's potential accession to NATO has been recognized by Washington as the brightest of all red lines for Moscow. Nevertheless, the White House rejected a draft treaty put forward by Mr. Putin in late 2021 that would have prevented the conflict in return for a halt to NATO's eastward expansion. Security expert Chidi Nwani joins us now to discuss this. Chidi, great to see you today.
Good afternoon. Thank you.
And so Ukraine has attempted to attack Russia directly in this war, and I could say this is the first time they have succeeded and sustained the attacks. What would you attribute this to?
Well, I think the key elements that we're looking at here is surprise. The Ukrainians have been able to achieve not just strategic surprise, but operational surprise. Now, on the strategic level, they've created a they've exploited a successful narrative that that they're short of manpower, short of equipment, that they're war weary. which has lulled the Russians into a false sense of security, allowing them to evacuate or move a lot of troops away from their own border regions to concentrate on their next hand. At the operational level, they successfully, in what's one of the most transparent battlefields on the planet, they've been able to mass troops, armor, artillery, and enablers, as well as electronic warfare equipment, been able to surprise the Russians, blind them, and then launch this attack. So from a military point of view, it's an extremely successful surprise operation.
And it must have come as a surprise to the Russian forces. President Putin says Russia will definitely retaliate. A worthy response is how he put it. He has also removed any possible talks of peace negotiation from the table. So Ukraine has two choices at this point: buckle under the pressure of those Russian attacks or press on as much as they can with the incursion. What do you think?
Well, the Ukrainians obviously have planned this operation quite well. They've, as I said, they've mastered troops and their enablers and also their logistics to be able to achieve this operational surprise and defeat of the Russians. The Russian retaliation will obviously come, but they have more or less run out of options short of nuclear attacks to escalate this crisis. The Russians will clearly retake their territory at some point. They have an advantage in numbers, equipment, and also they're fighting on home ground with interior lines. But they will have to take troops and equipment away from other fronts in order to do it, or use troops from the rest of Russia, which are in reserve for this. So, however it comes, the Russians have a significant dilemma to kind of overcome, which is, do they stop their attacks in the east or take troops away from other parts of Russia that might be vulnerable, or do they allow the Ukrainians to dig in and fight a long, bloody attritional war on their own territory?
Right, and in retaliation, from Moscow, you mentioned that, short of using nuclear weapons, maybe Russia is being boxed into a corner. Do you think this might be an option still?
I do not believe that the use of nuclear weapons is imminent or is even an option for the Russians. The use of nuclear weapons is very clearly a red line for not just their Western opponents, but the Chinese and any other nuclear power. Nobody wants to see the use or the free use of nuclear weapons. And the key problem the Russians have is that any nuclear launch, even if it's a tactical nuclear launch, is open to misinterpretation by all of their adversaries or even their allies, as I said, like China. So once you launch a nuclear weapon, there's nothing stopping any other nuclear power from thinking that's an attack on them and launching a retaliation. And having to drop a nuclear weapon on their neighboring country of Ukraine, it's not a single-edged weapon. Radiation travels, it crosses borders, it doesn't stop at the border. So if you drop a nuclear weapon on Ukraine, that radiation will cross into Russia and contaminate Russia as well. And so whilst there's the fear of retaliation, there's also the contamination from any act that they do in Ukraine coming back to them.
Right, and the US State Department has also hinted that it's concerned that hundreds of Iranian ballistic missiles might be transferred to Russia. Is that option still open to Russia?
Well, that's a very good question and a very interesting question, because the Iranians, as we know, have their own issues with the Israelis right now, and their options are quite wide open, but they will have use for their ballistic missiles, on the home front. The Iranians have made quite a good business out of selling both drones and expertise to the Russians, and also demonstrating around the world their skill in ballistic missile technology and drones through the Houthis and through the Russians. Whether the Iranians will now spare some of their arsenal when they've got the risk of a conflict with the Israelis, when Hezbollah has a risk of the conflict with the Israelis, to assist the Russians is very difficult to ascertain. I would suggest that at this particular point, whatever they've transferred to the Russians, obviously the Russians will keep, but they'll be hoping to keep their arsenal to themselves in case they have to use it to either support Hezbollah in Lebanon or to counter the Israelis directly.
Even as Russia is threatening retaliation, or is saying that it will retaliate, the incursion into Kursk by Ukraine, do you see it as a big win for Ukraine or a temporary one?
It's a bit of both. It's a big win for Ukraine because, as I said, the past year or so, the narrative, the Russians have been advancing and they've been winning. The Russians have been winning at a very, very high cost in men, material, and resources, but they have been, quite clearly taking territory from the Ukrainians, taking towns, taking land, and creating, as I said earlier, the narrative of victory that they are winning. We, as analysts, understand they're winning at a high price, but they were winning nonetheless. The Ukrainians have demonstrated with this operation that not only do they still have the military capacity to take the war to Russia, they also have a high level of operational military skill. Because this was a brilliant attack by military standards. To achieve this level of operational and strategic surprise against a power like Russia, with all the technology at their disposal, satellite surveillance, unmanned aerial vehicles, etc. To achieve that on their border is a great military success. Now, the question that we are at now is, what will the Ukrainians do with this success? Will they be able to hold that ground and force the Russians to fight for it, or hold it and force the Russians to negotiate for it, or will they just fight back to their border and destroy as much Russian equipment and manpower as possible while they do so? Either which option, as long as it does not result in a complete Ukrainian rout or defeat where they lose a lot more men and equipment than the Russians do, it's a victory for Ukraine.
Right, and this victory means that what Russian President Vladimir Putin says that he may be taking the negotiations off the table, but the Ukrainian president is insisting that Mr. Putin has no choice. Are we still looking at many months before this war comes to an end?
I would suggest we're looking at a few years before this phase of this war comes to an end, and then again a few more years before the war itself comes to an end, barring any dramatic surprises such as one side or the other losing their kind of political backing. For example, Putin leaving office, Zelensky leaving office, a Trump victory, for example, in the United States. I would suggest that there is a long way to go for this war. The war will end through negotiations, whether it's, but the question is who, on what terms. The Russians have put a very maximalist position, which is illogical, as well as have the Ukrainians. But there will be some compromise, and the question is how much will each side have to give up? As I alluded to earlier, if the Ukrainians are able to hold Kursk, then they have a very, very strong bargaining chip with the Russians to recover some of their territory. If they're unable to hold Kursk but inflict significant damage on the Russians, then again, the Russians no longer have that numerical and technological advantage, having lost a lot of troops in Kursk and in the east of Ukraine. So either which way, as long as the Ukrainians fight this battle intelligently, which they've done so far, they are increasing their hand in terms of the final negotiations.
Right, and as we wrap up this conversation, I wanted to get your take on former U.S. President Donald Trump accusing President Joe Biden of causing this war in the Ukraine in the first place and glorifying his own efforts at preventing the conflict if he was president. All true, or this is just his effort at scoring cheap political points? November is close by.
Well, yes, I think you covered it quite well. It is just a manner of way of scoring cheap political points, because there is no way that you could say Joe Biden caused this war. The war was caused by Vladimir Putin. He made the decision to mass troops on Ukraine's border. He made the decision to send those troops into Ukraine. I don't think that what an American president would or would not have done would have caused that war. I mean, short of Joe Biden, sending the level of support to Ukraine that we're seeing now before the war, it's unlikely that this war could have been prevented. It was a decision by a single person sitting in Russia to create this crisis or to start this war. So we can't really, we have to just take President President Trump's words with a certain pinch of salt. It's an election. He has to make these points. He has to kind of, hit on his rivals. But I don't think that is, from the analytical point of view, is either useful or even particularly logical to blame, the U.S. president for this war.
Right, Chidi, thank you so much for your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.